In the next section, we will discuss Part 1 of the random validation process in more detail. As we said earlier, for Part 1 of the process, all 80 LEAs that are selected will submit the completed random validation report, Part 1, via an online Qualtrics survey. There will be no documentation attached to the survey. The format of the questions will be similar to the program implementation questions from the compliance report. The timeline for Part 1 is as follows. LEA notification will take place on October 19th via email from Qualtrics. The LEA will have between October 20th and November 6th to complete the online survey. ESC staff have been trained and are available to provide technical assistance on the survey. The due date for the survey submission is November 6th. The initial notification email that LEAs will receive on October 19th will include the following: a link to the online survey, which is one-person use. You will be able to save your progress. You may leave and come back, but it is limited to one person's entering information. There will be a formal notification letter that describes the random validation process. There will be a random validation timeline so that no one is surprised by when things happen. There will be a hard copy of the survey questions for reference. This is to make it easier for the user to prepare for the online survey completion. It's important to realize that although we're providing a hard copy, no paper copies of the survey will be accepted. It must be submitted online. There will also be a link to the documentation matrix for each program. The matrix will describe the acceptable types of documentation that the LEA is expected to have on file. Before we dig into the survey itself, I'd like to discuss the documentation matrix. Each program area has developed a matrix to help LEAs better understand what acceptable documentation looks like for the program requirements that are included in this year's validation. Links to each matrix can be found on the Random Validation webpage. This is an example of the template that we use to develop the matrix. It lists the program requirement. It lists each type of documentation required. And for each type of documentation required, it describes what the acceptable documentation items would be for that particular requirement. This is a draft example for one of the programs. The program requirement would be for the meaningful consultation for the Title II Part A program. The type of documentation required are relevant pages from the District Improvement Plan and documentation of stakeholder meetings. Acceptable documentation of the relevant pages of the improvement plan would include a title page of the plan, and then only those pages of the plan that relate to the consultation. We're not wanting the district to try to submit the entire improvement plan, just those relevant pages. Documentation for the stakeholder meetings, stakeholders being those categories listed up there in the requirement, which would be teachers, principals, other school leaders, paraprofessionals, specialized instructional support personnel, charter school leaders, parents, community partners, and other organizations or partners with relevant experience and expertise. Those stakeholder meetings would need to be documented with agendas and dated minutes, sign-in sheets that are also dated that have the roles of the participants identified. In other words, who's a parent, who's a teacher, who's a paraprofessional. It would also be important to have a copy of any handouts that were provided to the participants during the consultation events. And if the district used surveys to do this consultation or parts of it, we'd like to see a copy of the survey and then what results came about as a result of the survey. There's also a couple of things I'd like to say about the online survey link that is provided in the email. The LEA can either use the link as provided in the email, or there is a URL that is also provided that the LEA can copy and paste into a browser. Unfortunately, only one person can use the link that's provided. The link is associated with the initial email recipient. This person may close the survey and return to finish it later without losing any of the previously entered information. But the survey itself may only be actually submitted once. If the LEA submits its survey and then finds that it needs to change information that was provided, this can be done by emailing esa.support@tea.texas.gov to request that the survey be reset. In this case, the entire survey would need to be completed again. It can't be done in parts. The first few items of the online survey will be LEA-specific information that is pre-populated based on the LEA's 2020-2021 Consolidated Federal Grant Application. Each of the programs will request similar information. There will be a contact name, email, and telephone number for each program, 1 or 2 program requirement questions, which basically the LEA will answer yes or no as to whether they have the documentation that's listed. If they answer no, they will say what the missing item is and explain the reason that the documentation is not available. And then each program area will have a space for an additional comment that's optional. The next several slides feature screenshots that simulate the actual online survey. The ESC region, the county district number, and the LEA name will be pre-populated. The next section of LEA data is also pre-populated based on the LEA's Consolidated Federal Grant Application. In this particular example, this LEA is participating in Title I Part A as an independent project. That's what the IND indicates next to Title I Part A. Title I Part C is also operating as an independent project, as is Title I Part D. This LEA is a member district, however, for Title II Part A. This particular set of information indicates also that the LEA is not using REAP or funding transferability for either Title II Part A or Title IV Part A. The Title IV Part A entitlement amount for this particular LEA is greater than $30,000. This LEA does have participating private nonprofit schools. All of this information will drive the questions that are asked later in the survey. It's important to note that if an LEA does not have a particular program in its application, it will not receive those particular questions. Because our sample LEA does have a Title I Part A program, the LEA will be asked to list a contact name, contact phone number, and a contact email for the Title I Part A program. Each of the program questions in the survey will follow the same basic format. There will be a requirement stated. For the first question for Title I Part A is based on this requirement. The Title I Part A school-wide program is based on a comprehensive needs assessment of the entire school that takes into account information on the academic achievement of children in relation to the challenging state academic standards, particularly the needs of those children who are failing or at risk of failing to meet the challenging state academic standards and any other factors as determined by the LEA. The LEA should consider the documentation that's listed that requires a yes response and decide whether it is in compliance with this requirement for all of its Title I Part A school-wide campuses. If the LEA has one campus that's school-wide that does not meet this requirement, the LEA should answer no, even though it may have this requirement for all of the remaining school-wide campuses. If the LEA selects yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the random validation process for 2020-2021. The documentation includes description of the campus's comprehensive needs assessment process, meeting agendas, meeting notes, sign-in sheets documenting the campus's C&A process. The campus improvement plan includes a summary of the C&A results and uses those results to determine program activities. And program evaluations from prior years are part of the C&A process to determine effectiveness and to inform decisions concerning program implementation. If the LEA has all of that, that means they select yes. If the LEA does not have all of that documentation for one of its school-wide programs, the LEA should answer no. At the end of the question, there is a back button so that the LEA could go back and answer previous questions differently, or there's a continue button. If the LEA chooses the continue button, the survey is going to be sure that all of the required questions on the particular page were answered before allowing the LEA to continue. For example, if the LEA forgot to enter information for the contact, the LEA would be prompted to do that before being allowed to continue on. If the LEA answers no to a program question, the next question the LEA receives will be requesting that the LEA indicate what item of documentation is missing and to enter an explanation for the reason for non-compliance. The second Title I Part A requirement. Each school served under Title I Part A shall jointly develop with and distribute to parents and family members of participating children a written parent and family engagement policy agreed on by such parents that shall describe the means for carrying out the requirements of subsections C through F. Parents shall be notified of the policy in an understandable and uniform format and to the extent practicable, provided in a language that parents can understand. Such policy shall be made available to the local community and updated periodically to meet the changing needs of parents and the school. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement for all of its Title I Part A campuses? If so, the LEA can answer yes. If the LEA selects yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the random validation process. A copy of the written parent involvement policy for the campus, meeting agendas, meeting notes, sign-in sheets documenting participation of parents in the development of the policy and periodic updates to the policy to meet the changing needs of parents in the school, evidence of policy distribution to parents and family members of participating students, and evidence of availability to the local community. If the LEA answers no, the LEA will be asked to indicate the item that's missing and to explain the reason for the non-compliance. At the end of the Title I Part A section, there is space provided for additional comments if the LEA would like to use it. This is an optional field. If the LEA has a Title I Part C program, the LEA will be asked for a contact name, phone number, and email for the person who is responsible for the Title I Part C program. The first question for Title I Part C is related to priority for services. The requirement states the LEA gives service priority to migrant children who made a qualifying move within the previous one-year period and who were failing or most at risk of failing to meet the challenging state academic standards. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? Yes or no? If the LEA selects yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. Priority for Services report from the New Generation System, District Priority for Services Student Action Plans. In addition, the following is required if the LEA has Priority for Services students. Individual Supplemental Programs Report from NGS, which lists supplemental services being provided to the Priority for Services students, and documentation that MEP-funded services are provided to the Priority for Services students first. If the LEA says yes, they can click and continue. If no, the LEA will be asked to indicate the item that's missing and to explain the reason for the non-compliance. The second Title I Part C program question is related to MEP-funded supplies, materials, and equipment. The requirement states all MEP-funded supplies, materials, and equipment were used only for MEP activities and to the benefit of MEP students. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? If the LEA selects yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. District and campus improvement plans showing the migrant-specific section, logs on use of equipment, although this is not required if MEP funds are used only for personnel performing MEP-related duties, and lists of participants. This is also not required if MEP funds were used only for personnel performing MEP-related duties. If the LEA answers no to this question, please indicate the items of documentation that are missing and explain the reason for the non-compliance. There is a section at the end of Title I Part C for LEAs to enter additional comments if they so choose. This is an optional section. If the LEA receives Title I Part D Subpart 2 funds, they will be asked to name a contact person as well as the phone number and email for Title I Part D. The program question related to Title I Part D concerns the formal written agreement with the facilities. The requirement states the LEA has a formal written agreement with each local facility it served under Title I Part D Subpart 2, and that the agreement addresses the program provided by the LEA as well as the responsibilities of the facility as described in Section 1425. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? If yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. A copy of the written agreement between the LEA and each facility, and a description of services provided by the LEA and a description of facility responsibilities. If the LEA answers no, but is missing one of those pieces of information, the LEA is asked to indicate what item is missing and to explain the reason for the noncompliance. If the LEA has additional comments, there is space provided. It is an optional field. If the LEA receives Title II Part A funds, we are requesting a contact name, phone number, and email for the person who's responsible for Title II Part A. The first program question for Title II is related to consultation. The requirement states the LEA meaningfully consulted with teachers, principals, other school leaders, paraprofessionals, specialized instructional support personnel, charter school leaders in an LEA that has charter schools, parents, community partners, and other organizations or partners with relevant and demonstrated expertise in programs and activities designed to meet the purpose of Title II Part A. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? If the LEA selects yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. Relevant pages of the District Improvement Plan, stakeholder meeting agendas and minutes, sign-in sheets, and materials used during consultation events, and/or surveys and their results. If the LEA answers no to this question, the LEA will be asked to indicate which items of documentation are missing and to explain the reason for the noncompliance. The second Title II Part A question is related to the ongoing nature of the consultation. The requirement states the LEA used data and ongoing consultation to continually update and improve Title II Part A activities. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? If the LEA selects yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. Relevant pages of the District Improvement Plan, stakeholder meeting agendas and minutes, sign-in sheets, materials that are used during consultation events, and/or surveys and their results. If the LEA answers no to this question, the LEA is asked to indicate the items of documentation that are missing and to explain the reason for the noncompliance. If the LEA has additional comments related to Title II Part A, space is provided, although this is an optional question. If the LEA receives Title IV Part A funds, the LEA is asked for a contact name, phone number, and email for the person who administers the Title IV Part A program. The first question that the LEA is given for the Title IV Part A program depends on the size of the LEA's entitlement, including any funds that are transferred into Title IV Part A. If the LEA receives less than $30,000, the LEA gets one question. If the LEA receives $30,000 or more, it receives a different question. This particular LEA, in our example, received more than $30,000. So its first question is as follows. The requirement states, the LEA conducted a comprehensive needs assessment tied to the 3 goals of Title IV Part A. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? If the LEA selects yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. A copy of the LEA's Comprehensive Needs Assessment, a description of the strategy used to collect data regarding the needs, and LEA identified data related to students' access to effective program activities. If the LEA answers no to this question, the LEA will be asked to indicate which items of documentation are missing and to explain the reason for the non-compliance. If our example LEA had received less than $30,000 as its Title IV Part A entitlement, this is the question it would have received. The requirement states, if receiving less than $30,000, did the LEA have a process to determine the program and/or the LEA needs? Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? If the LEA answers yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the random validation process. Input from stakeholders, focus groups, advisory committees, district improvement teams, and LEA identified data and reports. The second question that all LEAs receiving Title IV Part A funds will answer is as follows. The requirement states, the LEA engaged in timely and meaningful consultation with a broad range of stakeholders as part of their process in determining the targeted areas of improvement related to students' access to effective program activities. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? If the LEA selects yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. Agendas of focus groups, sign-in sheets, and meeting minutes. If the LEA answers no to this question, the LEA will be asked to indicate which item of documentation is missing and to explain the reason for the non-compliance. Space is provided for additional comments for Title IV Part A if the LEA chooses to use it. If the LEA has participating private nonprofit schools for any of its programs, the LEA will be asked to answer the following questions related to P&P. A contact name, phone number, and email for the person at the LEA who is responsible for equitable services to private nonprofit schools. The first question related to private nonprofit schools concerns timely and meaningful consultation. The requirement states, the LEA conducted timely and meaningful consultation with participating private nonprofit school officials regarding the implementation of the ESA programs according to ESA sections 1117 and/or 8501 as appropriate. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? In order to answer yes, this means that all the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. P&P affirmations reflecting participation in a timely and meaningful consultation. If the LEA answers no, the LEA will be asked to indicate which item of documentation is missing and to explain the reason for the non-compliance. For the second programmatic question related to private nonprofit schools, the requirement states, the LEA has procedures in place to ensure the LEA maintains control of technology, equipment, and supplies purchased for the Equitable Services Program. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with this requirement? If the LEA selects yes, this means that the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. LEA procedures to ensure the LEA maintains control of technology, equipment, and supplies purchased for the Equitable Services Program. If the LEA answers no to this question, the LEA will be asked to indicate which items of documentation are missing and to explain the reason for the noncompliance. Space is provided if the LEA wishes to add additional comments related to private nonprofit schools. The last section relates to unsafe school choice option. All LEAs that participate in the survey will be asked these questions. A contact name, phone number, and email for the person at the LEA who is responsible for the unsafe school choice option requirement. The requirement for unsafe school choice is a little bit long, so we've given it a little bit more space here. The requirement for the unsafe school choice option states, the LEA, as a condition of receiving funds under the Every Student Succeeds Act, must establish and implement a policy requiring that a student attending a persistently dangerous public elementary school or secondary school, as determined by the Texas Education Agency, or a student who becomes a victim of a violent criminal offense while in or on the grounds of a public elementary or secondary school that the student attends, is offered and allowed to attend a safe public elementary or secondary school within the local education agency, including a public charter school. If another campus is not available within the LEA, the policy should provide for other types of services to ensure the safety of the student. In addition, the LEA is encouraged to attempt to secure a cooperative agreement with another LEA to accept transfers when reasonable and appropriate. This requirement appears in Section 8532. The LEA is required to have the policy regardless of whether any campuses have been identified as persistently dangerous or if any students have been a victim of a violent criminal offense at the school. The LEA is required to have policies in place that address both of these contingencies. A charter school is a school of choice, but has to be able to provide other types of services to ensure the safety of the student. Does the LEA have documentation that demonstrates compliance with the USCO requirement as stated above? If the LEA says yes, this means that all of the following documentation is readily available for submission if this item is selected for Part 2 of the validation process. A copy of the policy approved as per LEA policies and procedures, and documentation that any student who has been affected by either of these circumstances has been offered the opportunity to transfer. If the answer to this question is no, please indicate the item of documentation that's missing and explain the reason for the noncompliance. Space is provided for additional comments if the LEA chooses to use it. At the end of the survey, when you're ready to submit your answers, please click on the Continue button below. You should then receive an email containing a link to a PDF of your responses, as well as information about the timeline for Part 2 of the validation process. Thank you very much for your participation. The email with a copy of the LEA's responses to the survey would be received probably within the next several minutes after the LEA submits. There would be a summary of the LEA's responses. There would also be a link to view a PDF file, which might have better formatting. But either way, the LEA would have a document that included both the question and the LEA's response.